A black man named George Thompson is arrested and accused of committing a serious crime. But the cops are stunned when they find out who he really is. How will this revelation change everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. A black man in his mid-40s with great physique named George Thompson is cruised down the winding country road, his hands resting comfortably on the steering wheel. The warm summer breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers. He hummed along to a soft melody playing on the radio, feeling content and excited about his best friend's upcoming wedding. As he drove, George couldn't help but marvel at the beauty surrounding him. Rolling hills covered in lush green grass stretched as far as the eye could see. Majestic oak trees dotted the landscape, their branches reaching towards the clear blue sky. It was a picture-perfect scene, like something out of a postcard. George glanced at his watch and furrowed his brow. He'd been driving for quite some time now, and the scenery, while beautiful, was starting to look unfamiliar. A nagging feeling in his gut told him he might have taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. Better safe than sorry, George muttered to himself, deciding it was time to ask for directions. As if on cue, a small diner appeared around the bend. Its red and white checkered awning and neon open sign beckoned to him like a beacon of hope. George smiled, grateful for the timely appearance of the quaint establishment. He carefully pulled into the gravel parking lot, the stones crunching beneath his tires. As he stepped out of his car, George smoothed down his casual shirt and adjusted his comfortable jeans. He may have been dressed for a road trip, but his military background had instilled in him a sense of tidiness that never quite left him. Taking a deep breath of the fresh country air, George made his way towards the diner's entrance. The bell above the door chimed cheerfully as he stepped inside, announcing his arrival to the handful of patrons scattered throughout the cozy space. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled his nostrils, making his stomach rumble. George realized he hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the tempting smells were a reminder of how hungry he'd become during his drive. As he stood in the doorway taking in the scene before him, George couldn't help but notice the curious glances thrown his way. It was clear that visitors, especially those who looked like him, were a rare sight in this small, predominantly white town. George stepped into the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly. The chatter inside hushed as heads turned to look at him. He felt the weight of their stares but kept his composure, offering a gentle smile to those he made eye contact with. The diner was cozy, with red vinyl booths and a long counter lined with chrome stools. The smell of coffee and fried food hung in the air. George approached the counter, where a middle-aged waitress was wiping down the surface. "Excuse me, ma'am," George said politely, his voice warm and friendly. "I was hoping you could help me with some directions. I think I might have taken a wrong turn." The waitress looked up, her eyes widening slightly as she took in George's appearance. She hesitated for a moment before responding. "Sure thing, honey. Where are you trying to get to?" As George explained his destination, he could feel the tension in the room. The other patrons tried to look busy, but their furtive glances and hushed whispers weren't lost on him. He'd experienced this kind of unease before and knew how to handle it with grace. The waitress, to her credit, was helpful and kind. She pulled out a map from under the counter and traced the route George needed to take with her finger. "It's not too far from here," she assured him. "You'll be back on track in no time." George listened attentively, nodding as she explained. "Thank you so much for your help," he said, his smile genuine. "I really appreciate it." As he turned to leave, George noticed a group of men in the corner booth watching him intently. Their expressions were a mix of curiosity and suspicion. George gave them a polite nod, which they didn't return. Walking back to his car, George could feel eyes on him through the diner's large front window. He didn't look back, instead focusing on the warmth of the sun on his face and the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of nearby trees. As George settled into his car, he took a deep breath, grateful for the kindness of the waitress. He was about to start the engine when suddenly, the quiet afternoon was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and blaring sirens. In a matter of seconds, George found himself surrounded by police cars, their red and blue lights flashing urgently. His heart raced as he watched officers pour out of their vehicles, guns drawn and pointed directly at him. "Step out of the vehicle with your hands up," a stern voice commanded through a megaphone. George's mind reeled. What was happening? Had there been some terrible mistake? Despite his confusion, years of military training kicked in. He knew the importance of staying calm in high-stress situations. Slowly and deliberately, George raised his hands where the officers could see them. He called out in a steady voice, "I'm coming out now. I'm unarmed." With great care, he opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. The hot asphalt burned through the soles of his shoes as he stood there, hands still raised high. "Get down on your knees," another officer shouted. George complied, his knees hitting the ground hard. He could feel the rough surface through his jeans, but he didn't flinch. His eyes scanned the scene, taking in the tense faces of the officers, their fingers hovering near triggers. The air was thick with tension. George could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, but he fought to keep his breathing steady. He knew that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted, and he was determined to get through this safely. As he knelt there, surrounded by drawn weapons and suspicious glares, George couldn't help but think of the many times he'd faced danger during his military service. But this was different. This time, he was being treated like a threat in his own country, the very nation he had risked his life to protect. The officers approached George cautiously, their weapons still trained on him. One of them, a young man with a stern face, stepped forward. "We have reports of a stolen vehicle matching your car's description," he said, his voice cold and accusatory. "Care to explain that?" George's heart sank. He realized the gravity of the situation, but he knew he had to stay calm. "Officer, there must be some misunderstanding," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his chest. "This is my car. I'm on my way to my best friend's wedding." The officer's eyes narrowed. Skepticism etched across his face. "Yeah, right. We've heard that one before." George tried again, his words measured and clear. "Sir, I can show you my registration and license. They're in the glove compartment." But his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The officers exchanged glances, their suspicion evident in their body language. They seemed more focused on the color of George's skin and his muscular build than on what he was saying. Another officer, an older man with graying hair, barked out, "Enough talking! On the ground now!" George slowly lowered himself onto his stomach, the rough pavement scraping against his chest. He could feel the heat of the asphalt through his shirt, but he didn't complain. He knew that cooperation was his best chance of getting through this safely. As one officer roughly handcuffed him, George tried once more to explain. "Please, just check my ID. It's in my back pocket. You'll see this is all a mistake." But his pleas were met with silence. The officers seemed determined to treat him as a criminal, ignoring his attempts to clarify the situation. George felt a wave of frustration and sadness wash over him. He had faced danger in war zones, but here he was being treated like a threat in his own country. As they pulled him to his feet, George caught sight of his reflection in the car window. He saw a man in casual clothes, on his way to celebrate love and friendship, now being treated like a dangerous criminal. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm him, but he held on to his composure, reminding himself that the truth would come out eventually. Despite George's calm compliance, the situation took a sudden turn for the worse. One of the younger officers, his face tight with tension, roughly grabbed George's arm and shoved him to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of George's lungs and he gasped for air. "Stop resisting," the officer shouted, though George hadn't moved a muscle. The other officers quickly joined in, their hands heavy on George's back as they forcefully pinned him down. George could feel the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists as they were snapped shut, far tighter than necessary. Through the haze of pain and confusion, George caught sight of the diner's windows. Faces pressed against the glass, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Some had their phones out, recording the scene unfolding before them. But no one came to his aid. No one spoke up. George's military training kicked in, reminding him to stay calm in the face of danger. He knew that any sudden movement, any word of protest, could be misinterpreted as resistance. So he remained silent, even as his heart raced and his mind screamed at the injustice of it all. The officers' voices were a blur of angry shouts and accusations. Their fear was palpable, a thick cloud of suspicion that seemed to blind them to the truth of the situation. George could feel their hands trembling as they patted him down, searching for weapons that weren't there. As he lay there on the hot pavement, his face pressed against the rough surface, George's thoughts drifted to his friend's wedding. He had been so looking forward to celebrating love and happiness. Now he wondered if he would even make it there at all. The bystanders continued to watch, their faces a mix of horror and helplessness. Some turned away, unable to bear witness to the scene. Others kept filming, their hands shaking as they captured the unfolding drama. The police officers roughly escorted George to their patrol car, his wrists still bound tightly behind his back. As they drove to the local police station, George's mind raced, but he kept his face calm and composed. He knew that staying level-headed was his best chance of getting through this ordeal. At the station, George was led into a small, stark room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the bare walls. An officer pushed him into a hard plastic chair, the handcuffs still digging into his skin. "Name?" barked one of the officers, a stern-looking man with graying hair at his temples. "George Thompson," George replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. The officer scribbled on a form, his pen scratching loudly in the tense silence. "ID?" George nodded towards his back pocket. "It's in my wallet, sir." With a suspicious glare, the officer retrieved George's wallet and began examining his driver's license. George watched as the man's eyebrows furrowed, clearly not finding what he had expected. "So, Mr. Thompson," another officer chimed in, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "care to explain what you were doing in our town?" George took a deep breath. "I'm on my way to my best friend's wedding. I got a bit turned around and stopped at the diner to ask for directions." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. It was clear they didn't believe him, or at least didn't want to. "And the car?" the first officer pressed. "We got a report of a stolen vehicle matching your description." "It's my car, sir," George explained patiently. "I have the registration in the glove compartment if you'd like to check." The younger officer snorted. "Oh, we'll check, all right, we'll check everything." As the questioning continued, George could feel the officers' frustration growing. They had expected this to be an open and shut case, but George's calm demeanor and straightforward answers were throwing them off balance. Finally, the older officer stood up. "We're going to run a background check," he announced, his eyes narrowed. "Don't go anywhere." As they left the room, George could hear them muttering to each other. He caught snippets of their conversation. "Gotta be something. Can't just let him go. Make this stick." George closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He knew they were hoping to find something, anything, to justify their treatment of him. But he also knew that his record was clean. He had served his country with honor, and had lived his life with integrity. As George sat in the stark interrogation room, the officers gathered in the adjacent office, their voices carrying through the thin walls. Officer Johnson, the older officer with graying hair, leaned against a filing cabinet, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know, Mike," he said to his younger partner. "Something doesn't feel right about this." Officer Mike Reynolds crossed his arms, his jaw set stubbornly. "What do you mean? He fits the description perfectly. It's gotta be him." Johnson shook his head slowly. "But did you see how calm he was? Most perps would be sweating bullets by now." A female officer, Sarah Martinez, chimed in from her desk. "I hate to say it, but are we sure we didn't jump the gun here? He seems pretty cooperative." Reynolds scoffed. "That's how they get you. Act all innocent, and then, bam, you let your guard down, and they're gone." Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, George sat quietly, his hands folded on the table in front of him. He took slow, deep breaths, willing his heart to stop racing. The injustice of the situation weighed heavily on him, but he knew that losing his cool would only make things worse. George thought about his friend's wedding, wondering if he'd make it in time. He thought about his years of military service, fighting for a country that still saw him as a threat because of the color of his skin. Despite the anger and frustration bubbling inside him, George remained outwardly calm and composed. Back in the office, Officer Johnson rubbed his temples. "Look, I'm not saying we should just let him go, but maybe we were a bit rough out there. Did we really need to throw him to the ground like that?" Martinez nodded in agreement. "He didn't resist at all. Maybe we should apologize if the background check comes back clean." Reynolds slammed his hand on the desk. "Apologize? Are you kidding me? We were just doing our job. He matched the description. End of story." As the debate continued among the officers, their voices grew louder, their opinions more divided. Some, like Johnson and Martinez, began to question their actions and biases, while others, like Reynolds, dug their heels in, convinced they were in the right. Through it all, George sat patiently, his face a mask of calm determination. He knew that his composure was his greatest weapon in this fight against prejudice and misunderstanding. The tense atmosphere in the police station was shattered by the sudden beeping of the computer. Officer Martinez's eyes widened as she scanned the screen, her face paling with each passing second. "Guys," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. "You need to see this." The other officers crowded around her desk, their curiosity piqued. As they read the background check results, a heavy silence fell over the room. George Thompson wasn't just an innocent man. He was a decorated war veteran. Officer Johnson's hand shook as he picked up the printed report. "Medal of Honor," he whispered, his voice filled with awe and growing horror. "He retired early due to severe combat injuries." The weight of their actions began to sink in. They had manhandled and falsely accused a national hero, a man who had risked his life for their country. Officer Reynolds, who had been the most adamant about George's guilt, stumbled back and collapsed into a nearby chair. His face was ashen and he looked like he might be sick. "What have we done?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Martinez covered her mouth with her hand, tears welling up in her eyes. "We need to apologize," she said firmly. "We owe him that much, at the very least." Johnson nodded, his shoulders slumped with the weight of their mistake. "I'll go talk to him," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "We can't undo what we've done, but we can start making it right." As Johnson made his way to the interrogation room, the other officers remained frozen in place, the reality of their actions sinking in. They had let their prejudices and fears guide them, and in doing so, they had dishonored a man who had sacrificed so much for his country. Through the one-way mirror, they could see George sitting calmly, his posture straight and dignified despite the circumstances. The sight of him now, knowing who he truly was, filled them with a deep sense of shame and remorse. Officer Johnson took a deep breath before entering the interrogation room. His hand trembled as he turned the doorknob, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. George looked up as the officer walked in, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the ordeal he had endured. Johnson's throat tightened as he met George's steady gaze. "Mr. Thompson," Johnson began, his voice cracking slightly, "I owe you the deepest apology. We've made a terrible mistake." George's eyebrows raised slightly, but he remained silent, allowing the officer to continue. "We've learned about your service to our country, your sacrifices." Johnson's words trailed off, overwhelmed by emotion. "There's no excuse for how we treated you. I'm truly sorry." George nodded, his expression softening. "I appreciate your apology, officer," he said quietly. "But I'm more concerned about the time. I'm supposed to be at my best friend's wedding, and I'm already late." Johnson's eyes widened, suddenly remembering the reason George had been traveling in the first place. "Of course, sir. We'll get you out of here right away." The officer quickly moved to unlock George's handcuffs, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. Once George was free, Johnson led him out of the interrogation room, where the other officers were waiting. The atmosphere in the station was thick with remorse as George emerged. Officer Martinez stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mr. Thompson, we can't begin to express how sorry we are. We'll do everything we can to get you to that wedding as soon as possible." George rubbed his wrists, looking at the group of chastened officers. "I understand you were doing your job," he said calmly. but I hope this experience teaches you something about judging people too quickly." The officers nodded solemnly, their faces etched with shame and regret. Reynolds, who had been the most aggressive during the arrest, couldn't even meet George's eyes. "We'll escort you to your car right away, sir," Johnson said, eager to make amends, "and we'll provide a police escort to ensure you get to the wedding as quickly as possible." As the officers hurried to prepare for George's departure, George stood tall, his dignity intact despite the injustice he had faced. His thoughts turned to his friend's wedding, hoping he could still make it in time to see the ceremony. As George stepped out of the police station, the bright sunlight felt like a warm embrace after the cold interrogation room. The officers followed him, their faces etched with remorse and shame. "Mr. Thompson," Officer Johnson said, his voice heavy with regret, "is there anything we can do to make up for our terrible mistake?" George turned to face the group of officers, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I appreciate the offer, but what I need most right now is to get to my friend's wedding," he replied gently. Officer Martinez stepped forward, her eyes still glistening with unshed tears. "We could provide a police escort to help you get there faster," she suggested earnestly. George shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "That's kind of you, but I think I've had enough police involvement for one day. I'll manage on my own." The officers nodded, understanding the weight of George's words. They watched as he walked to his car, his head held high despite the ordeal he had endured. As George reached his vehicle, he paused and turned back to the group. "I hope this experience teaches you all something valuable," he said softly. "We all have biases, but it's our responsibility to recognize and overcome them." With those parting words, George got into his car and started the engine. The officers stood in silence, watching as he pulled out of the parking lot and drove away, leaving them to contemplate their actions and the lessons they needed to learn. As George's car disappeared down the road, the officers exchanged glances, each of them feeling the weight of their mistake and the profound impact of George's grace under pressure. They knew they had a long way to go to make things right, not just with George, but with their community as a whole. George pulled into the parking lot of the wedding venue, his heart racing as he glanced at his watch. He was late, but thankfully, not too late. The sound of distant laughter and music drifted through the air, reminding him of the joyous occasion he was here to celebrate. Taking a deep breath, George stepped out of his car and straightened his slightly rumpled clothes. He ran a hand over his face, trying to shake off the lingering tension from the day's earlier events. This was his best friend's wedding, and he was determined to be present in the moment. As George walked towards the venue, he spotted the bride and groom exchanging vows under a beautiful floral arch. He quietly slipped into the back row, catching the eye of another guest who smiled warmly at him. George returned the smile, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The ceremony continued, filled with heartfelt words and tender moments. George found himself blinking back tears as he watched his friend seal his vows with a kiss. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and George joined in, clapping enthusiastically. As the newlyweds made their way down the aisle, George's friend spotted him and beamed. "George, you made it!" he exclaimed, pulling him into a tight hug. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," George replied, his voice thick with emotion. The reception was in full swing, with music playing and guests mingling. George made his way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries and congratulations. He laughed at jokes, raised his glass in toasts, and even hit the dance floor for a few songs. Yet, despite the festive atmosphere, George couldn't completely shake off the shadow of what had happened earlier. Every now and then, a fleeting memory of the confrontation would surface, causing his smile to falter momentarily. He'd quickly push it aside, focusing instead on the happiness surrounding him. But the effort to maintain his composure was taking its toll. As the wedding reception continued, George found himself fully immersed in the joyous atmosphere. He laughed with old friends, shared stories, and raised his glass in heartfelt toasts to the happy couple. The warmth and love that filled the room were palpable, a stark contrast to the cold fear and suspicion he had faced just hours earlier. While dancing with his friends, George's mind drifted back to the incident at the diner. The feeling of rough pavement against his cheek, the cold metal of handcuffs biting into his wrists, These sensations seemed so out of place in the midst of such happiness. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present moment. As he watched the newlyweds share their first dance, George couldn't help but marvel at the difference between this scene and the one he had experienced earlier. Here, people of all backgrounds came together in celebration, their differences forgotten in the face of love. It was a beautiful reminder of what the world could be. Throughout the evening, George was tempted several times to share his ordeal with his friends. The words hovered on the tip of his tongue, threatening to spill out. But each time he held back. He looked around at the smiling faces, the tears of joy and the unbridled happiness, and he couldn't bring himself to cast a shadow over such a perfect day. Instead, George threw himself into the festivities with renewed vigor. He danced until his feet ached, told jokes until his sides hurt from laughing, and hugged his friends with an intensity that surprised even him. In these moments of connection and joy, he found a balm for the pain and injustice he had experienced earlier. As the night wore on, George found himself standing alone for a moment, watching the celebration unfold around him. He felt a mix of emotions: gratitude for the love surrounding him, sadness for the prejudice that still existed in the world, and hope that days like this, filled with unity and acceptance, would become more common. The next morning, George woke up in his own bed, the memories of the wedding still fresh in his mind. But as he went through his morning routine, the events at the diner and police station crept back into his thoughts. He stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him with weary eyes. George's gaze fell on the framed medals hanging on his bedroom wall. Each one represented a moment of bravery, a time when he had put his life on the line for his country. He had fought for freedom, justice, and equality. Yet here he was, in the very nation he had sworn to protect, facing the harsh reality that prejudice still ran deep. As he sipped his coffee, George's mind wandered to the countless times he had experienced similar situations. The sidelong glances, the whispered comments, the unwarranted suspicion. They were all too familiar. He had always chosen to take the high road, to be the bigger person and let these incidents go. But this time felt different somehow. George sat down at his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around the warm mug. He couldn't shake the feeling that by staying silent, he was allowing these injustices to continue. But what could he do? Should he file a formal complaint? Reach out to local community leaders? Or should he simply move on, as he had done so many times before? The weight of the decision pressed heavily on George's shoulders. He knew that speaking up could bring attention to the issue, possibly preventing similar incidents in the future. But it could also open old wounds and subject him to further scrutiny and potential backlash. As he pondered his options, George's eyes fell on a photo of his military unit. The faces of his diverse group of brothers-in-arms smiled back at him, reminding him of the unity and camaraderie they had shared despite their differences. It was a stark reminder of what he had fought for, a world where people were judged by their character, not the color of their skin. George leaned back in his chair, the conflict within him growing stronger. He knew that the decision he made would not only affect him, but could potentially impact his community and beyond. The path forward wasn't clear, but George knew he had to carefully consider his next steps. Meanwhile, at the police station, the officers were still reeling from the revelation of George's background. Officer Mike Johnson, who had led the arrest, sat at his desk, his face etched with worry and regret. He couldn't shake the image of George's calm demeanor in the face of such injustice. With a heavy sigh, Mike opened his computer and began searching for information about George Thompson's military service. As he scrolled through the records, his eyes widened with each passing moment. The screen filled with commendations, medals, and glowing reports of George's bravery in combat. Mike's heart sank as he read about the injuries that had led to George's early retirement. The sacrifices this man had made for his country were immense, and yet they had treated him like a common criminal. "Hey, what are you looking at?" asked Officer Sarah Peters, noticing Mike's troubled expression. Mike looked up, his eyes filled with remorse. "I'm reading about George Thompson's military service. Sarah, we really messed up." Sarah leaned over to look at the screen. Her face paled as she took in the information. "Oh my God," she whispered. The weight of their actions pressed down on both officers. Mike felt a deep sense of guilt and responsibility for how George had been treated. He had been the one to make the call, to escalate the situation based on nothing more than suspicion and prejudice. "We need to do something about this," Mike said, his voice filled with determination. "We can't just let it go and pretend it didn't happen." Sarah nodded in agreement. "But what can we do? He's already gone, and I doubt he'd want to hear from us again." Mike thought for a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Maybe we need to look at our own procedures, our own biases. This can't happen again, Sarah. We're supposed to protect and serve everyone, not just some people." As they sat there grappling with their mistake and its implications, other officers in the station began to take notice. The atmosphere in the room shifted as the reality of what had happened sank in for everyone. Officer Mike Johnson took a deep breath, steadying himself as he approached the police chief's office. His heart raced, but he knew this conversation was necessary. He knocked on the door, his knuckles barely making a sound. "Come in," called Chief Roberts from inside. Mike entered, his face etched with worry. "Chief, do you have a moment? There's something important I need to discuss with you." Chief Roberts looked up from his paperwork, noticing the serious expression on Mike's face. "Of course, Johnson. What's on your mind?" Mike sat down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "It's about the arrest we made yesterday, sir. The man we detained, George Thompson." He began to explain the situation in detail, his voice trembling slightly as he recounted their actions. He described how they had treated George, a decorated war veteran, with suspicion and aggression based solely on his appearance. "We made a terrible mistake, Chief," Mike said, his eyes filled with remorse. "And I'm worried about what this means for our department, for our community." Chief Roberts listened intently, his brow furrowing as Mike spoke. The gravity of the situation was not lost on him. He knew that incidents like this could have far-reaching consequences, not just for the individuals involved, but for the entire police force. "I see," Chief Roberts said slowly, leaning back in his chair. "This is indeed a serious matter, Johnson. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." The chief's mind raced with the potential implications. He could already imagine the headlines, the public outrage if this story got out. But more than that, he recognized that this incident highlighted a deeper issue within the department. "We need to address this," Chief Roberts said firmly. "Not just this specific incident, but the underlying problems that led to it. Our training, our procedures, our biases, they all need to be examined." Mike nodded, relief washing over him. He had been afraid the chief might try to sweep this under the rug, but it seemed he understood the importance of addressing it head-on. "What do you suggest we do, sir?" Mike asked, eager to make amends and prevent similar incidents in the future. Chief Roberts wasted no time in addressing the issue. The very next morning, he called an emergency meeting with the entire police department. As officers filed into the conference room, a sense of unease filled the air. Many had already heard whispers about the incident with George Thompson, and they knew this wasn't going to be a routine gathering. The chief stood at the front of the room, his face stern but not unkind. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to talk about something important," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Yesterday, we made a mistake. A big one." He went on to explain what had happened with George Thompson, not sparing any details. As he spoke, the room grew quiet. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others looked down at their hands, shame evident on their faces. "This incident has shown us that we have work to do," Chief Roberts continued. "We can't allow our biases to cloud our judgment or influence our actions. We're here to protect and serve all members of our community, regardless of their race or appearance." The chief emphasized the importance of following proper procedures, reminding everyone that their actions had consequences not just for themselves, but for the entire department and the community they served. "From this day forward," he said, his voice growing stronger, "we will be implementing new training programs. We'll be reviewing our procedures, and making changes where necessary. And most importantly, we'll be working on ourselves, our attitudes, our assumptions, and our biases. As the chief spoke, a shift began to occur in the room. Officers who had been avoiding eye contact started to look up. Those who had been slouching sat up straighter. There was a growing sense that this could be a turning point for their department. "This isn't going to be easy," Chief Roberts admitted. "Change never is, but it's necessary. We have a responsibility to do better, to be better, and I believe we can do it." As the meeting concluded, Chief Roberts pulled aside Officer Johnson, the man who had led George Thompson's arrest. The chief's expression was serious, but not unkind. "Johnson, I need you to make a call," Chief Roberts said, his voice low. "We owe Mr. Thompson a formal apology, and I think it should come from you." Officer Johnson nodded, his face a mix of emotions. "Yes, sir. I understand." Back at his desk, Officer Johnson stared at the phone, George Thompson's number scrawled on a piece of paper before him. His hand hovered over the receiver, trembling slightly. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Johnson's heart raced with each ring. Finally, a deep voice answered. "Hello?" "Mr. Thompson?" Johnson's voice cracked slightly. "This is Officer Johnson from the Millbrook Police Department. I was hoping I could speak with you for a moment." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Go ahead," George replied, his tone neutral. Johnson swallowed hard. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to offer you a formal apology on behalf of our department. The way we treated you was completely unacceptable, and we're deeply sorry for what happened." George remained silent, listening. "We know that words aren't enough," Johnson continued, his voice growing steadier. "We want to make this right. Our department is committed to making changes, to doing better, and we were hoping you might be willing to help us with that." "Help you?" George's voice held a note of surprise. Johnson nodded, even though George couldn't see him. "Yes, sir. We'd like to invite you to speak with our department, to share your perspective. We think it could really make a difference in how we approach our work and interact with our community." There was another long pause. Johnson held his breath, waiting. Finally, George spoke. "I appreciate your call, Officer Johnson, and your apology, but I need some time to think about this. Can I get back to you?" "Of course, Mr. Thompson," Johnson replied quickly. "Take all the time you need, and thank you for hearing me out." As Johnson hung up the phone, he felt a mix of relief and uncertainty. He had made the call, offered the apology, but George's response was still up in the air. Now, all they could do was wait and hope that George would give them a chance to make things right. George sat in his living room, the phone still warm in his hand. The call from Officer Johnson had caught him off guard. He hadn't expected to hear from the police department again, let alone receive such a heartfelt apology. As he replayed the conversation in his mind, George's emotions swirled. The sincerity in Officer Johnson's voice had been unmistakable, but the memory of his mistreatment was still fresh. "A public ceremony?" George murmured to himself, shaking his head. The idea made him uncomfortable. He had never sought recognition for his service, and the thought of being in the spotlight made him uneasy. George stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street. He thought about all the times he had faced prejudice and discrimination, even after risking his life for his country. Could this ceremony really make a difference? As he pondered, George's mind drifted to the younger version of himself, the soldier who had believed he could change the world. That idealistic young man would have jumped at this opportunity without hesitation. George sighed deeply. Maybe this was a chance to be that change he had always hoped to see. Perhaps by sharing his story, he could help bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. After a long moment of reflection, George picked up the phone again. His fingers hovered over the keypad before he finally dialed Officer Johnson's number. When the officer answered, George's voice was steady and calm. "Officer Johnson, this is George Thompson. I've been thinking about your proposal." "Yes, Mr. Thompson?" Johnson's voice was eager but nervous. George took a deep breath. I've decided to accept your offer. If sharing my story can help promote understanding and change, then I'm willing to participate in the ceremony." The relief in Officer Johnson's voice was palpable. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson. We truly appreciate your willingness to work with us. This means more than you know." As they discussed the details, George felt a mix of apprehension and hope. He didn't know what would come of this ceremony, but he was determined to use this opportunity to make a positive impact. As news of the upcoming ceremony spread through the small town, the police department buzzed with activity. Officer Johnson took charge of the preparations, determined to make this event meaningful and impactful. The chief called a meeting with all the officers involved in George's arrest. "This is our chance to show the community that we can admit our mistakes and learn from them," he said, his voice firm but encouraging. Some officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. Officer Miller, who had been the most aggressive during George's arrest, spoke up. "I'm not sure I can face everyone," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The chief placed a hand on Miller's shoulder. "It takes courage to confront our mistakes, but that's how we grow. Your presence will show our commitment to change." Meanwhile, Officer Johnson worked tirelessly to organize the event. He reached out to community leaders, inviting them to speak alongside George. Local businesses offered to provide refreshments, turning the ceremony into a town-wide affair. As the day of the ceremony approached, George found himself growing nervous. He stood in front of his mirror, adjusting his tie. The weight of his medals felt heavy on his chest. He took a deep breath, reminding himself why he had agreed to this. At the town square, chairs were set up facing a small stage. Banners celebrating unity and understanding fluttered in the breeze. Officer Johnson paced back and forth, checking and rechecking every detail. People began to arrive, filling the square with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. The officers involved in the incident stood to one side, their faces a mix of shame and determination. Officer Miller kept his eyes on the ground, his hands fidgeting nervously. As George's car pulled up, a hush fell over the crowd. Officer Johnson stepped forward to greet him, extending his hand. "Thank you for being here, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. George nodded, taking in the scene before him. He saw the faces of the officers who had arrested him, the community members who had witnessed the incident, and many others who had come to listen and learn. In that moment, he realized the true importance of this gathering. As the day of the ceremony approached, George found himself standing in front of his bedroom mirror, lost in thought. He smoothed down his shirt, his fingers tracing the outline of his medals beneath the fabric. The weight of them felt heavier than usual, a reminder of the battles he had fought both on and off the battlefield. George took a deep breath, his eyes meeting his reflection. The lines on his face seemed to tell a story of their own, of struggle, resilience, and hope. He thought back to the day of his arrest, the fear and anger he had felt. But now those emotions had transformed into something else entirely. "Forgiveness," he whispered to himself, the word hanging in the air like a promise. George walked over to his window, looking out at the peaceful neighborhood he called home. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and gold. It was a new day full of possibility. As he watched the world wake up, George's mind wandered to the upcoming ceremony. He knew it wasn't just about him or the officers involved. It was about something much bigger, a chance for real change in the community. George closed his eyes, taking another deep breath. He thought about the words he would say, the message he wanted to convey. This was his opportunity to turn a painful experience into something positive, to use his voice to make a difference. "Empathy and understanding," he murmured, nodding to himself. That's what he wanted to encourage, for people to look beyond their differences and see the humanity in each other. As the morning light grew stronger, George felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. With each step, he was determined to lead by example, to show that forgiveness could be a powerful force for change. George picked up a framed photo from his nightstand, a picture of him and his fellow soldiers, arms around each other, smiles on their faces despite the hardships they had faced. It was a reminder of the strength that comes from unity, from standing together in the face of adversity. With renewed purpose, George set the photo down and began to prepare for the day ahead. He was ready to share his story, to speak out against prejudice, and to help build a community where everyone felt valued and respected. The day of the public ceremony arrived, bringing with it a sense of anticipation that hung in the air like a thick fog. The town square was filled to capacity, with people from all walks of life gathering to witness this unprecedented event. The crowd buzzed with hushed conversations, their eyes fixed on the makeshift stage where George Thompson and the police officers would soon appear. As the clock struck noon, the police chief stepped up to the podium. The crowd fell silent, their attention captured by the chief's solemn expression. He cleared his throat, his voice carrying across the square as he began to speak. "Good afternoon, everyone. We are gathered here today to address a grave mistake made by our department," the chief began, his words heavy with regret. "We failed in our duty to protect and serve all members of our community equally. Our actions were driven by bias and fear, and for that, we are deeply sorry." The chief's words seemed to ripple through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own biases reflected in the chief's admission. "We are here to acknowledge our mistakes, to learn from them, and to commit to doing better," the chief continued. "This is not just about one incident, but about systemic issues that we must address head-on." As the chief spoke, George stood off to the side of the stage, his posture straight and his expression calm. He could see the officers who had arrested him standing nearby, their faces a mix of shame and nervousness. George's heart went out to them, recognizing the courage it took to face the community after such a public mistake. The chief's voice grew stronger as he concluded his speech. "Today, we have the honor of recognizing Mr. George Thompson, a decorated war veteran who we wrongfully arrested. His grace and forgiveness in the face of our mistake is a lesson to us all." With those words, the chief turned and gestured for George to join him on stage. The crowd erupted in applause as George stepped forward, his presence commanding respect and admiration. The officers who had arrested him also moved towards the stage, ready to face the community and express their regrets. As George stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. The weight of the moment settled on his broad shoulders, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He took a deep breath, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the tension in the air. "Good afternoon," George began, his voice steady and warm. "I stand before you today not as a victim, but as a fellow human being who believes in the power of understanding and forgiveness." The crowd hung on his every word, their faces a mix of curiosity and admiration. "Many of you know me only as the man who was wrongfully arrested," George continued, "but I am so much more than that single moment. I am a son, a friend, a veteran who proudly served this country." George's voice grew stronger as he shared his story. He spoke of his childhood dreams of serving in the military, of the challenges he faced as a black man in uniform, and of the bonds he formed with his fellow soldiers. "During my time in service, I learned that unity is our greatest strength," George said, his eyes scanning the crowd. "We fought side by side, not caring about the color of our skin, but about the person next to us who had our back." As George recounted his experiences, including the injuries that led to his early retirement, many in the audience wiped away tears. The officers who had arrested him listened intently, their faces etched with a mix of shame and newfound respect. "The day of my arrest was difficult," George admitted, his voice softening. "But it was also an opportunity for growth, for change, and for healing." George paused, letting his words sink in. The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "I choose to forgive," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "Not because what happened was right, but because forgiveness is the first step towards real change. It's how we move forward, how we learn, and how we build a better community for all of us." As George concluded his speech, the audience erupted into heartfelt applause. Tears glistened in many eyes and people rose to their feet, moved by his words of forgiveness and hope. The sound of clapping hands filled the air, a testament to the impact of George's message. When the applause finally died down, the officers involved in George's arrest made their way to the stage. Their faces were etched with a mix of shame and determination as they stood before the community they had sworn to protect. Officer Johnson, the lead officer from that day, stepped forward first. His voice trembled slightly as he began to speak. "Mr. Thompson, I want to offer you my deepest and most sincere apology," he said, looking directly at George. "What we did that day was wrong and there's no excuse for it." The officer paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "Your words today have touched me deeply. They've made me realize how much harm our actions can cause, even when we think we're doing our job." Officer Rodriguez stepped up next. "We've all been doing a lot of soul-searching since that day," she admitted. "We're committed to making real changes, not just in how we do our jobs, but in how we see and treat every member of this community." The officers then outlined the steps they were taking to address bias and improve their interactions with the community. They spoke of increased diversity training, community outreach programs, and a new system of accountability within the department. As the officers spoke, the audience listened intently. Many nodded in approval at the proposed changes, while others wiped away tears, moved by the sincerity of the apologies and the promise of a better future. George stood nearby, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. He could see the impact his words had made, not just on the officers, but on the entire community. It was a small step, but an important one towards healing and understanding. As the officers concluded their speeches, the police chief stepped forward once more. In his hands, he held a polished wooden plaque. The chief's eyes met George's, filled with a mix of respect and remorse. "Mr. Thompson," the chief began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "On behalf of our department and our community, we'd like to present you with this plaque. It's a small token of our appreciation for your military service and your contributions to our community." George stepped forward, his face a mask of composure. As he reached for the plaque, the chief continued, "This gesture represents more than just an award. It symbolizes our commitment to change and our hope for a new beginning in the relationship between law enforcement and our community." The crowd watched in respectful silence as George accepted the plaque. He ran his fingers over the engraved surface, taking in the words that honored his service and sacrifice. For a moment, he stood there, the weight of the plaque in his hands mirroring the weight of the moment. Then George looked up, his eyes scanning the faces before him. He saw hope, expectation, and a desire for change reflected in their expressions. With a nod, he turned to the chief and extended his hand. As they shook hands, a ripple of applause began to build. It started softly, then grew louder, spreading through the crowd like a wave. Soon, the entire gathering was on their feet, their applause a thunderous affirmation of the moment's significance. The chief raised his voice to be heard over the applause. "This is just the beginning," he declared. "We have a long way to go, but with understanding, compassion, and a commitment to justice for all, we can build a better, more united community." George stood tall, the plaque held firmly in his hands. As he looked out at the cheering crowd, he felt a glimmer of hope. This moment, born from a painful experience, had become a catalyst for change. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a promising start. In the days following the ceremony, the police department wasted no time in taking action. Chief Roberts, determined to make good on his promise of change, initiated a comprehensive training program for all officers. The focus was clear: addressing bias and reinforcing proper procedures. On a crisp Monday morning, the first group of officers filed into the department's conference room. The atmosphere was tense, a mix of anticipation and unease. Officer Mike Johnson, who had been involved in George's arrest, sat near the front, his notebook open and pen ready. The instructor, Dr. Amelia Carter, a renowned expert in racial bias and police reform, stood at the front of the room. Her presence commanded attention as she began the session. "Good morning, officers," she said, her voice firm but kind. "We're here to tackle some difficult topics. It won't be easy, but it's necessary." Over the next few hours, Dr. Carter led the officers through a series of exercises and discussions. They explored the concept of implicit bias, examining how unconscious prejudices could influence their actions in the field. Officer Johnson found himself particularly affected by a role-playing exercise, placed in a scenario similar to George's arrest, but from the perspective of the civilian, he felt a knot form in his stomach as he experienced the fear and helplessness firsthand. "This isn't about making you feel guilty," Dr. Carter explained, noting the discomfort in the room. "It's about understanding different perspectives and learning how to approach situations with empathy and fairness." As the days passed, more officers cycled through the training. The sessions were intense, often leaving participants emotionally drained but enlightened. They delved into de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and the importance of community engagement. Chief Roberts made it a point to attend several sessions himself, demonstrating his commitment to the process. He observed the officers grappling with difficult truths and engaging in honest, sometimes heated discussions. By the end of the first week, there was a palpable shift in the department. Officers were talking more openly about their experiences and challenges. Many expressed a newfound awareness of their own biases and a determination to do better. In the weeks following the ceremony, George Thompson found himself at the center of a community-wide movement for change. His story had touched hearts and opened eyes, and now he felt a responsibility to use his voice for good. One sunny morning, George stood before a sea of young faces at Westfield High School. The auditorium was packed, students leaning forward in their seats, eager to hear from the man they'd all been talking about. "Good morning, everyone," George began, his voice steady and warm. "I'm here to share a story with you. It's not an easy one, but it's important." As George recounted the events of his arrest and the aftermath, he watched understanding dawn on the students' faces. Some looked shocked, others angry, but all were listening intently. "But this isn't just about me," George continued. "It's about all of us. It's about the world we want to live in and the changes we need to make." He encouraged the students to speak up when they witnessed injustice, to question their own biases, and to treat everyone with respect and dignity. The Q&A session that followed was lively, with students asking thoughtful questions and sharing their own experiences. Encouraged by the response at the high school, George expanded his outreach. He spoke at community centers, churches, and local clubs. Each time, he shared his story and his message of hope and unity. At the Pinewood Community Center, George addressed a diverse group of adults. "We all have a part to play in making our community better," he said. "It starts with understanding each other and standing up for what's right." His words resonated with many. After one talk, an elderly woman approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, squeezing his hand. "You've given me the courage to speak up about things I've seen but never knew how to address." As George continued his advocacy work, he noticed small but significant changes in the community. People were having more open conversations about race and prejudice. The police department, true to their word, was actively engaging with the community in positive ways. George's impact extended beyond just talks. He worked with local leaders to establish a community advisory board, bringing together diverse voices to address issues of inequality and promote understanding. The police department, inspired by George's message of unity and change, began to implement new community outreach programs. Chief Johnson, determined to make lasting improvements, gathered his officers to discuss their next steps. "We've made a good start," he said, looking around the room. "But we need to do more. We need to rebuild trust with our community." Officer Mike Davis, who had led George's arrest, raised his hand. "Chief, I'd like to volunteer to help with these programs. I feel like I owe it to George and to our community." Chief Roberts nodded, a small smile on his face. "I appreciate that, Mike. We could use your experience to help others learn." Over the next few weeks, the department launched several new initiatives. They started a Coffee with a Cop program, where officers would meet with residents at local cafes for casual conversations. They also began organizing community sports events, bringing together police and local youth for friendly games of basketball and soccer. Officer Davis and his colleagues who were involved in George's arrest took active roles in these programs. They shared their experiences openly, using their mistakes as teachable moments for both their fellow officers and the community. At one Coffee with a Cop event, Officer Davis sat across from Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly resident who had always been wary of the police. "I want you to know," he said, his voice sincere, "that we're committed to doing better. We're here to listen and learn." Mrs. Rodriguez nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "It's good to see you trying," she said. "It makes me feel a little safer knowing you're working to change." The department also started a mentorship program, pairing officers with at-risk youth. Officer Sarah Lee, who had been present during George's arrest, volunteered immediately. She was paired with Jamal, a teenager who had been in trouble with the law before. "I know it might be hard to trust me," Sarah said during their first meeting, "but I'm here to support you, not to judge you." Over time, these programs began to show results. The community started to view the police department in a new light. Residents who had once been hesitant to interact with officers now greeted them warmly on the streets. George's story of forgiveness and the police department's efforts to change began to spread beyond the small town. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon it caught the attention of national media. George's powerful message of understanding and unity in the face of adversity struck a chord with people across the country. One morning, George received a call from a producer of a popular national talk show. "Mr. Thompson," the producer said, excitement in her voice, "we'd love to have you on our show to share your story." George hesitated for a moment, then agreed. He knew that sharing his experience could help others and promote positive change. The day of the show arrived, and George found himself sitting under bright studio lights, facing a large audience. As he recounted his story, the room fell silent, hanging on his every word. "It would have been easy to be angry," George said, his voice steady and sincere. "But I chose forgiveness, because only through understanding and compassion can we hope to build a better world." The audience erupted in applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. George's appearance on the show went viral, and soon, invitations to speak at events across the country began pouring in. George accepted these invitations, traveling from city to city to share his message. He spoke at universities, community centers, and even at a national police conference. Everywhere he went, people were moved by his words and his unwavering belief in the power of forgiveness. At a large rally for social justice, George stood before a crowd of thousands. "We all have a choice," he said, his voice carrying across the hushed audience. "We can let our experiences embitter us, or we can use them as a catalyst for change. I choose change. I choose hope." As George's influence grew, he became more than just a speaker. He became a symbol. People looked to him as an example of resilience, forgiveness.